The parchment on the table is still damp at the edges where someone's thumb, stained with iron gall ink, pressed too hard and smudged a name. It is late summer, 1349, in a manorial hall somewhere in England, and the light that falls across this roll of accounts is the color of old bone through smoke. Outside, the barley is almost ready to cut. Inside, the harvest is already rotting, on this page. The lord of the manor sits at the high end of the board, mail shirt showing beneath a travel-stained surcoat, sword belt loosened but still buckled. He has ridden back from the shire court, from talk of royal writs and new labor laws, and he is tired in the way men get when their world has stopped fitting the rules they were trained to obey. Beside him, on a lower bench, the reeve waits, a peasant made into manager, a man who knows every strip of field and every widow left behind. His hands are chapped from work, but the ink on his fingers is fresh. He is the one who wrote these names. Opposite him, half in shadow, stands a single surviving villain, broad hands, sun-darkened face, linen shirt that smells of earth and sweat and fear. He has walked in from the village with his cap in his hands and news in his mouth. A neighboring lord, over the hill, is paying double for reaping. The artifact between them looks harmless. A manorial account roll, 3 years' worth of cramped Latin and Anglo-French, entries and tallies from 1348 to 1351. But as we unroll it, the ink turns into a casualty list. A name, then a line through it, then the same formula over and over, mortuus per pestem. Dead by the pestilence. Each stroke of the clerk's knife crossing out a tenant is also a stroke through a rent payment, a labor service, a promise. This is our crime scene log. Listen to the silence in the room as the reeve reads. Johannes at Welly, mortuus per pestem. 2 yard lands vacant. No tenant found. Agnes, widow of Thomas, mortua per pestem. Cottage without holding. Beyond the open door you can hear crows in the field, and beyond them, faint and far, the cough of a church bell tolling for someone else whose name will never make it to this page. The Lord's jaw tightens. He knows these names, he has ridden past their plots, taken their coin, ordered them to muster when the king's summons came. He also knows the other names pressing on him from beyond this hall, Edward III in Westminster, demanding taxes and men for the war in France, royal officials reminding him of his obligations, sheriffs measuring his estate against the last assessment before the plague. The Lord must do 3 things at once: harvest his domain, raise cash, and keep enough people alive and loyal to call upon when the king next sails for Calais. The clock is not abstract. He has weeks before the grain in the field spoils. Days before the tax collector arrives with parchment of his own. Hours before word spreads through alehouses and churchyards about how this particular lord responds to the new world. Will he pay the higher wages the survivors demand, or will he call on the king's law, new, sharp and punitive, to crush their bargaining power? The reeve clears his throat, and the room listens to more than his words. My lord, he says, we cannot bring in the harvest with the labor we have. The tenants owing week work are dead, or their sons have gone to work in other villes. Men say over the hill they are paid 2pence, even 3, for a day's reaping. The surviving villain looks up quickly, as if the number itself might be a crime. Before the pestilence, he owed this lord labor instead of cash, set days ploughing the lord's land, then his own, boon work at harvest, the inescapable duties of villanage in exchange for protection and his narrow strips of soil. You did not bargain with that. It was customary, like the seasons. But now, half the village is gone. Land lies empty. The same duties fall on fewer shoulders, and the old fear of running away is suddenly lighter than the hunger in your children's faces. Nearby manors whisper, come, and we will pay you money, good silver, to reap our grain. For the first time in his life, this man feels the weight of his own body as something with a price. The invisible players crowd the hall. Plague ships, long since docked in Messina, in Genoese ports, in Marseille, have already spent their cargo of death across the continent. In Westminster, royal clerks sharpen their quills to draft new rules to hold down wages, to pin workers to parishes like beetles to a board. Bishops fret over empty benefices and unauthorized preachers. Merchants count dwindling customers and rising freight risks. All of them, without knowing this particular reeve or this particular peasant, will shape what happens in this room. The Lord leans forward. If I pay more, he says slowly, I break the king's ordinance. If I pay the old rates, the fields go uncut and we all starve. If I let you walk to another manor, I lose you forever. If I hold you here by law. He does not finish the sentence, because the word is ugly, compulsion. So here is our central question, written not in theory but in cold ink and sweat and fear, in these 3 plague years when half a continent's people are dying and the price of every surviving pair of hands is rising, who sets the new value of a human life? Desperation, conscience, or coercive law? We are the archives of humanity, and this is the case of the plague that raised wages, and the ruling class that tried to make that illegal. To understand what is happening in this hall, we have to roll the parchment back and lay a map of Europe over it. Think of the manorial roll as one blood-spattered logbook from a wider battlefield. On the eastern edge of that map, in 1346, there is a siege on the Crimean coast, the Genoese outpost of Caffa, held by Italian merchants, ringed by the forces of the Golden Horde. Chroniclers like Gabriele de Mussi tell a story that sounds like something between horror fiction and early biological warfare, plague-swollen corpses hurled over the city walls by Mongol catapults. Whether or not every detail happened as told, the accusation itself is evidence. By the mid-1340s, people at Caffa can see a disease killing whole camps at once, and they already suspect it moves with bodies and breath. Genoese ships flee the siege, carrying grain, merchants, sailors, rats, and in their fleas, a bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis. In October 1347, some of those ships reach Messina. Dock workers stagger off with fevers, buboes swelling in their groins and armpits, skin mottling black. Within weeks, the pestilence ignites Sicily, then jumps to Marseille, then to other Mediterranean ports. From there, it rides the trade routes north and west, the same arteries that carry wool, wine, spices, and letters. In the early months of 1348, it enters the beating heart of Italian commerce, Florence, Pisa, Siena. Boccaccio will later write of fathers abandoning sick children, of bodies piled in churches like trade goods in a warehouse. In June 1348, an English port town, Melcombe Regis, modern Weymouth, on the Dorset coast, records the arrival of sickness from ships. From that first beachhead, the plague fans out through England, following merchants, pilgrims, and royal messengers. London will be struck, so will tiny villages whose names only survive as smudged ink in rolls like the one on this table. The disease itself is a shapeshifter. Bubonic plague, fever, chills, and those infamous swellings in the lymph nodes, tender and dark. Pneumonic plague, it moves into the lungs, and now every breath is a weapon, blood flecks the air with each cough. Septicemic plague, a lightning strike in the bloodstream, killing so quickly some victims die before any bubo forms. Medieval witnesses did not know the word bacterium, but they knew the timeline. One day a man is drinking ale in the tavern, 3 days later, he is in the ground, if the ground has space left. Modern estimates suggest that in a few years, between a third and half of Europe's population will die. In some parishes, whole lineages vanish. In others, strangely, the role of tenants remains intact, as if the pestilence skipped them like a stone skipping a wave. This unevenness will matter, because it creates islands of bargaining power and desperation side by side. Before the plague, the operating system that runs this manor, this kingdom, much of Latin Christendom, is feudal. Not the romantic feudalism of storybooks, but a spreadsheet of duties and dues etched into memory and parchment. Villains, unfree peasants, are bound to the soil. They owe week work, specific days laboring on the Lord's domain fields. They owe boon work at peak seasons, like harvest, when everyone turns out with sickles and scythes to bring in grain under the reeve's watchful eye. In return, they have their own scattered strips to farm, a right to use common pasture, some measure of protection from bandits and rival lords. Rents are customary, often fixed in kind, a certain number of hens, days with a cart, a set measure of oats. The key word is customary. It is supposed to be stable, anchored in precedent, sanctified by the church, and enforced by manorial courts where the lord or his steward presides. Crucially, mobility is restricted. You cannot simply walk away from your holding without permission. If you do, you are a fugitive, subject to fines if caught. The village, the manor, the lord's domain, they are not just places. They are constraints. Hovering over this system is the Catholic Church. Its priests preach that the hierarchy of lord and peasant mirrors the hierarchy of heaven, God, angels, clergy, nobles, commons. Charity is supposed to flow downwards, obedience, tithes, and deference flow upwards. Monasteries own land and collect rents like lords, parishes collect tithes in grain and coin. The message from pulpit and statute roll alike is clear: the order of the world is divinely ordained and relatively fixed. Then the Black Death hits that order like an axe. Manorial account rolls from 1348 to 1351 are full of sudden vacancies. No tenant found. holding in the Lord's hand for lack of air. Land lies waste for want of people. Fields go unploughed because the men and oxen that should be on them are in mass graves. Courts note that certain customary works simply were not performed, there were not enough bodies. In some regions, wages for hired laborers, especially at harvest, spike. Where once a reaper might have earned a penny a day, now he can demand 2, even 3. Desperate lords quietly pay, despite the old customs, because grain standing in the field represents not just food but coin and survival. Archaeologists find deserted medieval villages, low humps in the earth where houses once stood, a lonely church standing above ridge and furrow with no congregation. In those places, the pestilence did not just wound the community, it effectively erased it. Into this chaos steps not a healer, but the law. In 1349, Edward III's government issues the Ordinance of Labourers. It is framed as a response to many valiant beggars and workers who, we are told, refused to serve unless given excessive wages. The ordinance commands that no one take wages higher than those customary before the pestilence. It orders all able-bodied persons under a certain income level to accept work when offered at those rates. Charity is to be restricted so as not to encourage idleness. It is, in essence, an emergency decree. Reality has changed, and the state's first move is to forbid the change. 2 years later, in 1351, the Statute of Labourers passes Parliament. It takes the emergency instinct and chisels it into permanent stone. Maximum wages are specified more clearly. Workers are forbidden to leave their hundred, their local administrative area, without letters of permission. To refuse to serve at the set wage is no longer just rude, it is a crime. Justices of laborers are appointed across the realm to enforce the regulations, to hold special sessions, to fine and imprison offenders. England is not unique. In Florence, in the Low Countries, in parts of France, city councils and seigneurs pass their own attempts at wage control and movement restriction. They increase fines for fleeing serfdom, they tighten guild rules, they treat bodies as resources that must not be allowed to follow demand. Meanwhile, the church groans under its own casualties. Priests die in their hundreds, especially those who administer last rites to the sick. Bishops scramble to fill parishes, sometimes ordaining men with minimal education. Papal bulls condemn flagellant movements, bands of laypeople processing through towns, whipping themselves in public penance and sometimes preaching their own visions. The popes also denounce attacks on Jews, but parchment from Avignon cannot extinguish fire in Strasbourg. In 1349, as plague fear peaks, the city of Strasbourg expels and massacres its Jewish community. Accusations flare, Jews have poisoned wells, spread powder in the fountains, conspired with distant enemies. Under torture, confessions are extracted, then used to justify burning whole communities alive or forcing their conversion. Conveniently, many of these victims were moneylenders. When they die, their Christian debtors are freed of obligations. Fear and financial opportunity walk hand in hand. Ritual breaks down. Graveyards overflow. Pits are dug outside city walls, bodies are layered with quicklime. Chroniclers report people dying without confession, without candles, without the usual liturgical comfort. The structures that told people who they were and where they fit, feudal law, sacramental rhythm, communal routines, cannot keep up with the body count. And yet, amid the panic, there are experiments in control that look eerily familiar. By the 1370s, the Adriatic port of Ragusa, today's Dubrovnik, begins to impose a Trentino. Ships and travelers must wait 30 days in isolation before entering the city. Venice and other ports follow with a quarantino, 40 days. Time itself becomes a barrier, an unseen wall meant to trap invisible contagion. Other towns, even without formal quarantine, shut their gates to outsiders, expel beggars, or set up local cordons. Authorities start counting more carefully. Parish registers, hearth taxes, manorial surveys all become tools to know who is left, who can pay, who can serve. This is early surveillance, not yet the modern state, but a prototype built from fear and ink. When we lay these pieces on the table, the dead bodies, the abandoned holdings, the frantic laws, the lynch mobs, we can see the pattern begin to shimmer through. The fundamental shock is simple: feudal Europe assumed an abundance of cheap, immobile labor and relatively fixed land. The Black Death flips that equation. Now there is abundant land and scarce labor. That scarcity gives surviving workers bargaining power. And power, once tasted, is not easily surrendered. Court records in England and elsewhere show rising prosecutions for fugitive serfs. A villain leaves his manor to work elsewhere at higher wages, his original lord sues for his return or for compensation. Lords sue each other for poaching laborers by offering too generous terms. The statute of laborers is broken so often that the records of its enforcement become, ironically, a witness to how impossible it is to enforce. The market has moved one way, the law is trying to drag it back. Think of the wage laws as a counteroffensive. They are not dry regulations in a vacuum. They are weapons deployed by a frightened elite trying to freeze time. The words on the parchment are moralized, high wages are condemned as excessive, uncharitable, disruptive of the common good. Peasants who ask for more are labeled greedy, idle, insolent, never simply rational actors whose families have survived a disaster and now value their lives more highly. This is a familiar maneuver: take a shift in power and recast it as a moral failing in those who benefit. Enforcement is brutal, but also limited. Some workers are imprisoned, others are fined, shamed, branded as vagrants or troublemakers. Yet jails cost money. Justices of laborers must be paid, riding circuits takes time. Lords pick their battles, enforcing harshly where they must make an example, looking the other way when they themselves quietly offer forbidden wages. In 1351, when England's Parliament gathers in Westminster to pass the Statute of Labourers, the room is dense with overlapping interests. The king wants revenue for his French campaigns. Nobles and knights want their estates to function. Town representatives worry about craft wages. They are confronted with a new reality: the old bargain between land and labor has been shattered by mortality that no one ordered and no one can cancel. At that moment, they stand at a fork in the road. They could acknowledge the new scarcity of labor and renegotiate obligations, formalizing higher wages, easing villanage, trading some control for stability. Instead, they choose coercion. They legislate against reality. In the short term, this choice buys them some time. In some places, wages are pushed down for a while. The elite classes reassure one another that they will not betray their order by bidding against each other for workers, at least not openly. Tax revenues recover enough to keep the war machine wheezing along. But the long-term cost is corrosive. Peasants, artisans, even lesser gentry know what their labor can fetch on an open market. They have seen it in neighboring towns, heard it from wandering workers, felt it in coins heavier in their palms. When law tells them they are worth less than what they have already proven, resentment sinks deep. That resentment will burst in 1381, when English peasants and townsmen rise in revolt, marching on London under leaders like Wat Tyler and the mysterious preacher John Ball, whose sermon asks, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The Statute of Labourers is not the only cause of that revolt, but it is a key grievance, the memory of a law that tried to chain them back to pre-plague status. If we step back even further, beyond England, beyond the 14th century, a blueprint emerges. Disasters that kill people but leave land and capital intact act as repricing machines for human life. After such shocks, the value of labor rises, whether in wages or in bargaining power. Those who control law and force face a choice: adapt to that new value, or try to criminalize it. Over and over, elites justify coercive controls as necessary, for order, for tradition, for the common good. They tolerate or even encourage scapegoating that conveniently destroys creditors, rivals, or despised minorities. In 1349 Strasbourg, Jewish creditors burn and their ledgers with them. In other towns, rumors that lepers or foreigners spread disease lead to expulsions and confiscations. Moral panic does double duty as debt relief and political consolidation. Yet catastrophe also breeds innovation. Quarantine rules, wage laws, more detailed population counts, these tools emerge from fear but will persist and evolve as instruments of statecraft. They help rulers manage risk but also sharpen hierarchies. People become units on lists, taxable, conscriptable, punishable. In the ledgers, the value of a day's work rises and, over generations, serfdom weakens in much of Western Europe. In England, villanage erodes through commutation, labor services converted into money rents, partly because owners and tenants alike find it easier to navigate a world where labor is precious by using cash. Economically, a single pair of hands is worth more. Spiritually and emotionally, something darker happens. Chroniclers note that after the first shock, death becomes strangely normalized. When whole households die, there are fewer mourners left for each new grave. People move into abandoned houses, take over tools, settle on new land. Life continues, but with a numbness, as if the scale of loss has overloaded the circuits of grief. The paradox is stark: each surviving worker's life has more bargaining value, yet the society as a whole becomes more accustomed to mass death. Politically, rulers learn that their strength rests not just on land or castles, but on bodies they can count and command. Tax rolls, muster rolls, manorial surveys, they are all versions of the same insight: a human is both a soul and a line item. The plague years teach governments to see populations as resources that must be tracked, regulated, and, when necessary, sacrificed. The roll on our table, with its crossed-out names and rising wages squeezed into margins, is a rough draft of our world. And the story it tells did not end in 1351. It still moves under our feet. In the 20th and 21st centuries, pandemics and mass illnesses again jolt labor markets. After the 1918 influenza, some industries faced worker shortages and rising wages. Families re-evaluated their tolerance for crowded factories and barracks. After COVID-19, we watched essential workers risk their lives for low pay while others worked from home. We saw employers call for a return to normal even when hospitals were still full and supply chains still strained. In some sectors, wages rose; in others, workers quit in waves, reassessing what their lives and time were worth. Once again, the question hovered: who gets to decide the value of a human life, those who live it, or those who budget it? Governments and employers today often frame worker demands as unreasonable, inflationary, a threat to competitiveness. When nurses strike after burnout, when delivery drivers push back against unsafe quotas, the language used against them is not so far from the 14th century complaints about insolent laborers. People are still treated as cost inputs in war, logistics, production. The vocabulary has changed, but the ledger logic has not. Inequality shapes exposure and protection. In the 14th century, some city gates shut to outsiders while grain is hoarded within; the poor are left to fend outside walls. Today, borders close, vaccines are distributed unevenly, and access to healthcare depends on wealth and passport. Then and now, some lives are buffered, others are deemed expendable. Different mechanisms, same triage. The Statute of Laborers is an early prototype for emergency decrees that try to hold back economic tides. Price controls, wage caps, states of exception justified by crisis, they all echo that medieval instinct: when reality changes faster than power can adapt, prohibit reality. Modern governments openly use instruments like the value of a statistical life to weigh the cost of safety regulations or public health interventions. A number is assigned, millions of dollars per hypothetical avoided death, to decide whether to impose a speed limit, require cleaner air, or fund a vaccine campaign. Medieval theologians would find this explicit pricing of life blasphemous. Yet hidden in the manorial rolls and the Statute of Laborers is the same cold arithmetic: how much is a peasant's life worth in rent, in labor days, in tax? Our quarantines and surveillance tools are more advanced but not fundamentally different from Ragusa's Trentino or Venice's Quarantino. Digital contact tracing, border closures, travel bans, lockdowns, they are refinements of an old question: who is allowed to move, and who is locked in place for the security of others? Workers in care homes or meatpacking plants discover that their freedom of movement is tightly tied to someone else's food supply, someone else's comfort. Once again, bodies become both vectors and shields. And the scapegoats have not vanished. In 1349, it is Jews accused of poisoning wells, lepers accused of spreading poison, foreigners accused of carrying curses. In recent crises, it is migrants blamed for disease, scientists accused of conspiracies, shadowy elites or outsiders imagined as deliberate engineers of plague. Online, rumors about lab leaks, 5G towers, microchips in vaccines spread faster than the virus itself. Like the medieval accusations, they offer simple villains, emotional clarity, and sometimes convenient cover for financial and political motives. Debt and blame still intersect. Then, the burning of a Jewish quarter wipes out bond obligations. Now, market crashes or emergency policies can be pinned on scapegoated groups while the architects of risk quietly restructure their portfolios. Each time a society accepts an easy scapegoat, it keeps the machinery ready to sacrifice someone else in the next crisis. This is why those 3 plague years, 1348 to 1351, still matter. They are a brief window in planetary time, but the shock they deliver rewires Western Europe's labor relations, demography, and statecraft. Our wage labor systems, our ideas of mobility, our methods of counting and controlling populations grow, in part, out of this graveyard. When we read a single estate's account roll as both casualty report and negotiation transcript, we see the blueprint of how power reacts to sudden shifts in human value. And that blueprint is still active. The lord in our smoky hall, the reeve with ink-stained fingers, the villain deciding whether to risk running, they stand at the beginning of a story we are still inside. Look again at the parchment on the table. By the final entries, some years after the worst waves of plague, the handwriting is calmer. Vacant holdings have new tenants. Next to the names of laborers hired for harvest, the wages listed are higher than before the pestilence. In some places, those rates are called customary now. What was once denounced as illegal, greedy, destabilizing, the higher price of a human day's work, has become the new normal. In the cramped margins of this roll, you can see the end of one world and the rough draft of ours. Here, then, is the verdict this case forces on us. When catastrophe reprices human life, power's first impulse is to deny the new value rather than to honor it. Over and over, the record shows rulers trying to legislate away the lived worth of the people who remain. And here is the mirror. We live in a century of shocks, pandemics, climate disasters, wars, technological disruptions that remove or redefine jobs. Each shock quietly revalues human lives, making some work more dangerous, some communities more vulnerable, some skills suddenly essential. Each time, someone will try to pass a modern statute of laborers, in policy if not in name, to freeze wages while profits rise, to lock migrants in camps while demanding their labor, to push for a return to normal that was never safe or just. Each time, we will be told that this is necessary, that anything else is chaos. This channel exists to resist amnesia. Join the investigation. Treat every old roll of accounts, every treaty, every ruin, as a crime scene where power and survival left fingerprints. When you hear debates about minimum wage, about gig workers' rights, about who gets a ventilator or a boat seat or a visa, bring this manor hall with you. Ask, whose reality is being legislated out of existence? Whose bargaining power is being rebranded as greed? The records cannot tell us what the villain in our opening scene decided. Did he take the risk, slip away at dawn to the neighboring manor for double wages, hoping his lord's men would not recognize his back in the next village? Did he stay, cowed by the threat of the statute, trading his brief leverage for safety and habit? Did the lord secretly pay more, breaking the law to save the harvest while pretending obedience on paper? These are choices not recorded, but reenacted in different forms around us. So here is the legacy question I leave with you, something no search engine can answer for you. Imagine your world is hit by a crisis that suddenly makes your time, your skills, your body more valuable than they were yesterday, because of a pandemic, a climate disaster, a technological failure. Those above you in the hierarchy move quickly to cap that value by law, regulation, or contract, insisting that accepting more would be selfish, destabilizing, unpatriotic. You know, as clearly as the 14th century reaper did, what your life and labor are actually worth now. Do you obey the ordinance and keep your place, or do you break the law of your age to honor the new price of your own existence, and what debt do you owe, if any, to those who cannot afford to take that risk? That crossroads is where history keeps meeting us. The rest is what we write, in ink and in blood, on the next roll of accounts.